Here on the History Experiment, we dig into the stories history textbooks were too afraid to tell you. And this one changes everything you thought you knew about America's golden age. The year is 1945. World War II is over. The good guys won. The Nazis are defeated. Justice is being served at Nuremberg. That's the story, right? Wrong. While American soldiers were liberating concentration camps, while the bodies were still being counted, while the world was still in shock, the United States government was quietly doing something that would horrify every single person who fought in that war. They were recruiting the enemy. Not just any enemy, not foot soldiers or bureaucrats. They were going after the most dangerous men in the Third Reich. The scientists, the engineers, the weapons designers, the men who built Hitler's rockets, the men who ran experiments on living human beings, the men with blood so soaked into their hands that no amount of soap could ever wash it clean. And America didn't just hire them. America erased its crimes, forged their paperwork, gave them homes in the suburbs, let them coach Little League, let them go to church on Sundays, let them become professors, let them become American heroes. And then, in the ultimate twist that nobody talks about, those same men sent Americans to the moon. This is Operation Paperclip. And once you know what really happened, you'll never look at NASA the same way again. April 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing in real time. Adolf Hitler is hiding in a bunker beneath Berlin, dictating final orders to generals who no longer have armies. Cities are burning. Soldiers are surrendering by the hundreds of thousands. The most powerful military machine the world had ever seen is being torn apart from both sides. The Americans and British closing in from the west, the Soviets closing in from the east. But even as the fighting raged, even as ordinary soldiers were still dying in foxholes across Germany, something else was already happening. Something quiet, something deliberate, something that had nothing to do with winning the war, and everything to do with winning what came next. American intelligence officers, wearing military uniforms, carrying rifles, moving through bombed-out German towns, were not just looking for enemy combatants. They were looking for files, for blueprints, for laboratories, for names. Specifically, they were looking for one name above all others: Wernher von Braun. Von Braun was 33 years old. He was tall, charming, impeccably dressed even in wartime, with the kind of easy confidence that made people trust him immediately. He spoke perfect English. He had a magnetic smile. He could explain rocket propulsion to a room full of generals and make every single one of them feel like they understood it. And he had built Hitler's V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile, the weapon that had rained down on London and killed thousands of civilians. Von Braun knew the war was lost. He had known it for months, and he had already made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was going to surrender to the Americans, not the Soviets. Not because he had any great love for America, but because he was a man who wanted to go to space, and he understood, with cold, calculating clarity, that the Americans would give him the resources to do it. And he also understood something else. He had something the Americans desperately needed. And desperation in the right hands is a very powerful bargaining chip. On May 2, 1945, Wernher von Braun walked up to an American soldier near the town of Reutte in the Austrian Alps. The soldier, Private First Class Frederick Schneikert, was so stunned that his first instinct was to reach for his weapon. Standing in front of him was a man in an expensive suit, his arm in a cast from a recent car accident, flanked by a small group of German officers. Von Braun introduced himself in perfect English. The private had no idea who he was. Within 48 hours, American intelligence absolutely did.
Before we go any further, you need to understand what the Americans actually found when they started moving through Germany in those final weeks of the war. Because what they found was not just one scientist, not just one laboratory. It was an entire civilization of weapons science, the most advanced military technology on the planet, built by some of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century. In a salt mine near the town of Nordhausen, American soldiers discovered something that left veteran combat troops standing with their mouths open. Buried hundreds of feet underground, hidden from Allied bombing raids, was the Mittelwerk, a massive underground factory where the V-2 rockets had been assembled. The tunnels stretched for miles, the machinery was enormous, the engineering was extraordinary, and scattered throughout were the bodies, not enemy soldiers, slave laborers, concentration camp prisoners, mostly from the Dora Mittelbau camp above ground, who had been worked to death building weapons for the Reich. 12 to 20,000 people died in those tunnels. Some were killed outright for infractions. Others simply worked until their bodies gave out, then were replaced by fresh prisoners shipped in from other camps. The men who ran this operation, who knew about the slave labor, who signed the requisition orders, who watched people die and went back to their drawing boards, were the same men the Americans were now planning to recruit. Colonel Holger Toftoy, the U.S. Army Ordnance Officer tasked with exploiting German rocket technology, didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the bodies. He was thinking about the blueprints. He was thinking about the 100 completed V-2 rockets he ordered his men to physically load onto American trucks and ship back to the United States before the Soviets arrived and claimed that sector of Germany. He got the rockets out. The Soviets got there 3 days later and found empty tunnels. Round one to America. But the rockets were useless without the men who understood them, and that was when the real operation began. Not the military operation, but the bureaucratic one, the one that required not guns or trucks, but paperwork and the willingness to lie.
The operation didn't start with that name. In its earliest form, it was called Operation Overcast. The idea was simple, if morally complex. Identify the most valuable German scientists and engineers, bring them to the United States on temporary contracts, extract their knowledge, then send them back. That was the plan. It was never the reality. By the time the operation was renamed, the new name, according to popular legend, came from the practice of using paper clips to attach new cover sheets to the files of scientists whose Nazi records were being flagged, hidden, or rewritten. It had expanded far beyond its original scope. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, was the organization tasked with running the program. And the JIOA had a problem, a big one, a potentially program-ending one. The State Department and the Immigration and Naturalization Service had rules. Specifically, they had a rule that said known members of the Nazi Party, and especially anyone who had been involved in war crimes, could not be admitted to the United States. This was a reasonable rule. It was, in fact, the obvious rule. You just fought a world war against these people. You executed some of them at Nuremberg. You can't then turn around and give them a house in Alabama. But the JIOA didn't see it that way. The JIOA saw the rule as an obstacle. And so they did something that, if it had been discovered at the time, would have been an enormous scandal. They rewrote the files. Intelligence agencies went through the records of scientists they wanted to bring over and systematically removed or altered incriminating information. Membership in the Nazi Party? Gone. Participation in programs that used slave labor? Erased. Evidence of war crimes? Reclassified, buried, made inaccessible.
New biographies were created, new histories were written. Scientists who had been active, enthusiastic members of the Nazi regime were transformed, on paper, into men who had been apolitical, technical experts, reluctant participants, or practically resistance fighters. The JIOA then submitted these sanitized files to the State Department, which, not knowing what had been done, approved the immigration of men it would never have admitted under normal circumstances. It was a fraud. It was a government-perpetrated, systematic, deliberate fraud. And it worked.
In September 1945, the first group of German rocket scientists, 104 of them, including Wernher von Braun, arrived in the United States. They were taken to Fort Bliss, Texas, a military installation near El Paso, right on the border with Mexico. For the first few years, their lives were strange and circumscribed. They were not prisoners exactly, but they were not free either. They could not leave the base without escorts. They could not contact their families in Germany without military supervision. They were, in the language of the program, wards of the army. Their expertise was being mined with the efficiency of an industrial operation. But they were also being slowly, carefully, deliberately integrated into American life. They were given English tutors. They were taken on carefully supervised trips to American towns. They attended baseball games. They were introduced to American food, American television, American culture. The process was not accidental. It was a conscious effort to transform these men, in their own minds and in the minds of anyone who might meet them, from German scientists into American ones. The scientists, for their part, adapted with striking speed. Von Braun, in particular, proved to be a natural at American life. He was gregarious, enthusiastic, and possessed of a showman's instinct for public relations that would later make him one of the most recognizable faces in America. He learned American slang. He developed a taste for bourbon. He became, by all accounts, genuinely enthusiastic about his new country, or at least about what his new country could do for his dreams of space exploration. Meanwhile, back in Germany, the Soviets were doing exactly the same thing. Operation Paperclip did not happen in a vacuum. The Soviets had their own program. They called it Operation Oso Aviakim, and they were just as aggressive, just as unscrupulous, and just as determined to exploit German scientific talent for their own purposes. The difference was that the Soviets, being less patient with negotiation, sometimes simply rounded up scientists and their families and transported them to the Soviet Union by force in the middle of the night without warning. The Cold War had not officially begun, but the space race, the arms race, the race that would define the next 50 years of human history, was already underway. Both superpowers were running the same play. Both were building their futures on the shoulders of the men who had served Adolf Hitler. By 1950, the scientists at Fort Bliss had been moved to a new facility, the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. And with that move, the temporary arrangement, the short-term contract, the plan to extract knowledge and send them home, quietly became permanent. These men were not going back to Germany. They were building new lives, buying houses, joining churches, enrolling their children in American schools, becoming, in every practical sense, Americans.
Of all the scientists who came to America through Operation Paperclip, none became more famous or more controversially celebrated than Wernher von Braun. His trajectory in America is almost impossible to believe, except that it's all documented. Born in 1912 in a small Prussian town, von Braun had been obsessed with space since childhood. He read science fiction voraciously. He corresponded with rocket pioneers. He joined the German Rocket Society as a teenager and was building and firing experimental rockets by the time he was in his early 20s. When the Nazis came to power, von Braun made a calculation. The Nazi military was interested in rockets. The Nazi military had money, and money, for a man who wanted to build the largest rockets ever designed, was everything. In 1933, he joined the Nazi Party. Later, he joined the SS, the Schutzstaffel, Heinrich Himmler's elite force, the organization most directly responsible for running the concentration camps. Von Braun would later claim, unconvincingly, that both memberships were coerced, that he had no real choice, that he was a scientist above all else. The documentary record tells a different story. Von Braun visited the Mittelwerk, the underground rocket factory, multiple times. He saw the conditions, he saw the prisoners, he saw the bodies. He continued his work. He wrote letters requesting more slave labor for specific technical tasks. He attended meetings where the use of concentration camp prisoners was discussed as a logistical matter, a resource allocation question, no different from ordering steel or rubber. After the war, when American intelligence officers questioned him, von Braun acknowledged knowing about the conditions at the Mittelwerk. He expressed regret, the measured, carefully calibrated regret of a man who had been coached on exactly how much regret to express. And then he went back to work. In America, the story of von Braun's past was not exactly hidden, but it was aggressively managed. When journalists got too close to the truth, they were discouraged. When former prisoners attempted to speak out, they were ignored. The government had made its choice. Von Braun was too valuable to sacrifice on the altar of historical accountability. And so the transformation continued. The SS officer became the American visionary. The man who had built missiles to kill British civilians became the man who would help put Americans on the moon. The British, for what it's worth, never forgot. When von Braun visited England in later years, there were protests. Survivors of the V2 attacks on London didn't appreciate being asked to celebrate the man who had built the weapon that killed their neighbors. But in America, the story was much simpler. In America, Wernher von Braun was a hero.
The move to Huntsville changed everything. Huntsville in the early 1950s was a small southern city known mainly for watercress farming and a modest textile industry. Within a decade, it would be utterly transformed, not just economically, but culturally, demographically, psychologically. A city of cotton fields became a city of rockets, and the men responsible for that transformation were German. The locals initially regarded the newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. These were, after all, the people they had just fought a war against. German accents in an Alabama grocery store were not an everyday occurrence. There were awkward moments, misunderstandings, occasional hostility. But the scientists were friendly. They were well-dressed. They bought houses in good neighborhoods. Their children went to local schools and played with American kids. And they were bringing jobs, good jobs, government jobs, jobs with security and purpose to a city that had not had much of any of those things. Within a few years, the German scientists and their families had become part of the fabric of Huntsville. They joined the local country club. They attended the same churches as their American neighbors. They became fixtures at local restaurants and civic organizations. Wernher von Braun, in particular, was a beloved figure, charming, accessible, always willing to sign autographs and explain his dreams of space to anyone who would listen. The work being done at the Redstone Arsenal, meanwhile, was redefining what was militarily possible. The team, now formally called the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, developed the Redstone rocket,
a direct descendant of the V-2, built on the same principles, using the same expertise, achieving ranges and accuracies that far exceeded anything the American military had managed on its own before the war. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite, a beeping metal sphere the size of a beach ball that circled the Earth every 96 minutes and terrified the American public, it was the Huntsville team that the United States turned to in its moment of crisis. There was a dark, perfect irony in this. The people who launched Sputnik were Soviet scientists, many of whom had been captured or recruited from Germany at the end of the war, working under the direction of Sergei Korolev, a Soviet engineer who had spent years in a Siberian labor camp under Stalin, but survived to become the father of the Soviet space program. The people who were being asked to respond to Sputnik were American scientists, many of whom had been recruited from Germany at the end of the war, working under the direction of Wernher von Braun. The space race, at its core, was a German civil war fought on a cosmic scale. America's answer to Sputnik came on February 1, 1958, when the Army Ballistic Missile Agency launched Explorer-1, the first American satellite, atop a Jupiter C rocket designed by von Braun's team. America was back in the race, and from that moment, the trajectory was set.
NASA was established in July 1958, created specifically in response to the Sputnik shock, and from almost the moment of its creation, the German team in Huntsville was central to everything it did. Von Braun became director of NASA's Marshall Flight Center in Huntsville when it was established in 1960. The mission assigned to him was the most ambitious in the history of human civilization: build a rocket powerful enough to send human beings to the moon and bring them back alive. What followed was the Saturn V program, and the Saturn V rocket, still to this day the most powerful operational rocket ever built, is arguably the greatest single engineering achievement in human history. It stood 363 feet tall. It generated 7.6 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. It burned through 20 tons of fuel per second, and it worked with extraordinary reliability during the most watched, most scrutinized series of launches in history. 12 human beings walked on the moon. All 12 got there because of rockets designed by a team led by a former SS officer who had used slave labor to build missiles that killed civilians. That sentence should sit with you for a moment. Neil Armstrong's famous words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," were broadcast around the world on July 20th, 1969. An estimated 600 million people watched. It was, by almost any measure, the most significant moment in the history of human exploration. A species that had evolved on a single planet reached out and touched another world for the first time. And sitting in mission control, watching the monitors, was Wernher von Braun. He wept, by all accounts genuinely. This was the moment he had dreamed of since childhood. This was why he had joined the Nazi Party, built the V-2, survived the end of the war, surrendered to the Americans, endured Fort Bliss, built his career in Alabama. Not for Hitler, not for America, for this, for the moment when human beings left the earth and stood somewhere else. Whether that personal passion excuses anything he did along the way is a question that history has never fully resolved. Von Braun is the famous name, but Operation Paperclip brought over more than 1,600 scientists, engineers, and technicians. Most of them are not famous, most of them you have never heard of, and some of them were far more monstrous than von Braun. Take Walter Schreiber, a German military doctor who attended the Nuremberg Medical Conference in 1942, a conference where the results of experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners were presented as scientific data. Experiments involving freezing people to death, infecting them with diseases, operating on them without anesthesia.
Schreiber was later brought to the United States through Operation Paperclip and given a position as a researcher at the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine in Texas. When journalist Dorothy Killigan exposed him in 1952, the resulting public outcry was significant enough that the military actually acted. Schreiber was quietly relocated to Argentina, where he spent the rest of his career. He was never tried for anything. Take Kurt Blome, a Nazi medical official who ran experiments on concentration camp prisoners at Dachau, testing biological weapons on living human beings. He was actually tried at Nuremberg and acquitted, partially because key evidence had been withheld. He was then recruited by the United States Army Chemical Corps to continue his research on biological warfare. Take Hubertus Struckhold. His case is particularly striking because he became famous, celebrated even. He is widely called the father of space medicine in America, the man whose research laid the groundwork for understanding how human bodies behave in the zero-gravity environment of space. His name was on buildings. Awards were given in his name by medical and aviation organizations. He was also, according to records declassified decades after his death, directly involved in experiments conducted at Dachau in which prisoners were placed in low-pressure chambers simulating high-altitude conditions, then subjected to conditions that killed them, while researchers recorded the results. The building named after him at the U.S. Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine was renamed in 2006 after the evidence became impossible to ignore. The award given in his name by the Space Medicine Association was discontinued, but he died in 1986, celebrated, honored, never prosecuted. There were others, many others. The declassified records, which historians have been working through for decades, continue to reveal names and stories that the government hid for half a century. The breadth of the cover-up was staggering, and it was not accidental. It was policy.
Not everyone went along. There were people, inside and outside the government, who knew what was happening and tried to stop it. They were, in almost every case, unsuccessful, but their stories deserve to be told because they represent something important, the fact that choices were made, that the cover-up was not inevitable, that at multiple points along the way, people could have done the right thing and chose not to. Within the State Department, there were officials who objected strenuously to the sanitization of the scientists' files. Samuel Klaus, a State Department lawyer, identified specific cases where he believed immigration law was being violated and war criminals were being protected. His objections were overruled. His memos were filed and forgotten. Among the survivors of the Holocaust camps, there were people who recognized names and faces and tried to sound alarms. Yogi Berra once said that it gets late early out there, and in the case of Holocaust survivors testifying about Operation Paperclip, it got late very fast. Their testimony was dismissed, their identifications questioned, their credibility attacked. The government had already decided what it needed these men to be, and inconvenient survivors were not going to change that. Within journalists, there were occasional investigations. Drew Pearson, the prominent Washington columnist, wrote critically about the program at various points. The Boston Globe published pieces questioning the backgrounds of some of the scientists. But the Cold War provided a near-perfect defense for any criticism. These men were necessary. The Soviets were doing the same thing. Would you rather the Soviets had them? National security, that magic phrase, that conversation-ending incantation, shut down most serious public debate before it could gain momentum. The most sustained effort to expose the program came not from journalists or government insiders, but from a research team led by Linda Hunt, whose 1991 book, Secret Agenda, drew on recently declassified documents to lay out the full scope of what had happened.
By then, most of the scientists involved were dead or elderly. The statute of limitations on any potential criminal charges had long since run out. The Cold War was ending. The political will to revisit the decisions of 1945 simply did not exist. History had moved on. The moon landing was still the moon landing. The rockets still worked. The achievements were real, even if the men who achieved them were not who America had been told they were.
Wernher von Braun died of pancreatic cancer on June 16, 1977. He was 65 years old. He had spent the last years of his career at the private aerospace company Fairchild Industries, still dreaming of Mars, still sketching mission profiles, still believing that the human future was in space. His death was mourned. Obituaries in major American newspapers described him as a visionary, a pioneer, the man who put America on the moon. President Jimmy Carter issued a statement calling him one of the greatest rocket scientists in history. The tributes were genuine and numerous. The British were more restrained. The historical reckoning with Operation Paperclip has been slow, uneven, and incomplete. For decades, the program remained classified. When documents began to be declassified, starting in the 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s and 2000s, the picture that emerged was significantly darker than the official narrative. Organizations that had given awards to scientists later revealed to have had direct involvement in war crimes quietly discontinued those awards. Buildings were renamed, plaques were removed, but no one was ever prosecuted. No one ever stood trial. The men who gave the orders to recruit these scientists, who signed off on the falsification of their records, who knowingly protected war criminals because they were useful, those men went to their graves with their decisions unexamined by any court of law. What Operation Paperclip leaves behind is a question that America has never fully confronted. What is the cost of a shortcut? The United States got to the moon. That is an extraordinary achievement, one that still fills most Americans with legitimate pride. The scientific and technological advances that came out of the space program, in computing, in materials science, in medicine, in communications, are real and enormous. The world is genuinely better because human beings went to space. But it was built, in significant part, on a foundation of stolen lives. The lives of the people who died in the Mitterwork tunnels, the lives of the people who died in the medical experiments that produced the knowledge Hubertus Strugholt and others brought to America, the lives of the people who were incinerated by V-2 rockets that Wernher von Braun designed and was proud of. Those people never got to see the moon landing. They never got to see what their suffering was used to build. They were expendable in the calculations of powerful men because they were not the right nationality, not the right religion, not the right anything. Operation Paperclip asked a question that governments have been asking since the beginning of organized civilization. Are there things so valuable that any means of obtaining them is justified? The United States in 1945 answered yes. Whether that answer was right is something each person who learns this history has to decide for themselves.
Here is what makes Operation Paperclip not just a history lesson, but something relevant to the world you wake up in every morning. The infrastructure of the modern American aerospace and defense industry was built in significant part by men who served the Third Reich. The institutional knowledge, the organizational culture, the specific technical approaches, they trace a direct line back to Peenemünde, the German rocket base on the Baltic Sea where the V-2 was developed. NASA's Saturn V rocket did not emerge from nowhere.
It emerged from the V-2, which emerged from a weapons program funded by a genocidal regime using slave labor. The mathematics of orbital mechanics that American engineers used to plan the Apollo missions were developed in part by men who had previously used those same mathematics to calculate the trajectories of missiles aimed at civilian populations. This does not make the Apollo program evil. It does not mean the moon landing was wrong, but it does mean that the story of how America got to space, the real story, the full story, is considerably darker and more complicated than the heroic narrative most Americans grew up with. Every major power that emerged from World War II built its post-war military and scientific capabilities on a foundation of captured German expertise. The Americans had Operation Paperclip. The Soviets had Operation Aviakim. The British had their own programs for extracting German scientists and technology. The French did as well. The entire Cold War, the arms race, the space race, the decades of nuclear standoff that defined the second half of the 20th century was, in a very real sense, built on a German foundation. The scientists who developed the weapons that made the Cold War possible were, on both sides, significantly informed by the work of men who had served Adolf Hitler. This is not a comfortable thought. It is not supposed to be. The world is built on compromises, on decisions made by people under pressure, with incomplete information, facing real dangers, making choices they believed were necessary. The men who ran Operation Paperclip were not cartoon villains. They were Americans who believed genuinely that the Soviet threat was existential, that German expertise was essential, that the ends justified the means. They may even have been right about the Soviet threat. They may have been right that German expertise was essential. What they were not right about, what history has made clear, is that you can build something lasting and good on a foundation of hidden crimes. The truth eventually always comes out. The classified documents eventually get declassified. The decisions that seemed smart and necessary in 1945 look different when the full record is available 70 years later. The question is not whether Operation Paperclip was necessary. The question is whether it was honest. And the answer to that question is unambiguously no.
So where does that leave us? Operation Paperclip is not a simple story. It never was. It is not a story of pure American villainy. The Soviets did the same thing and arguably did it worse. It is not a story of unambiguous American heroism. The cover-up was real. The crimes were real. The victims were real. It is not even a story that has a clear moral resolution, because the same program that protected war criminals also produced the Saturn V rocket and put human beings on the moon. What it is, at its core, is a story about choices. In 1945, with the world in ruins and a new kind of Cold War beginning to take shape, the United States government made a series of choices. They chose to prioritize capability over accountability. They chose to prioritize the future over the past. They chose to protect men who deserved prosecution because those men were useful. And then they chose to hide it. For decades, the American public was told a story about the space program that was inspiring and true in its broad outlines, but systematically deceptive in its details. The men who built the rockets were presented as American visionaries, not German ex-Nazis. The suffering that produced their expertise was erased from the official history. The victims of the Mittel work and the medical experiments were written out of the narrative because their presence made the narrative uncomfortable. The full story, the one you now know, is both more terrible and, in a strange way, more honest.
It is the story of a world that had to make impossible choices in the aftermath of an impossible catastrophe. It is the story of human beings, being, as they so often are, simultaneously capable of extraordinary achievement and extraordinary moral failure. Wernher von Braun reached the moon. He also used slave labor to build weapons of mass murder. Both of those things are true. Both of those things matter. The people who died in the tunnels of the Mittelwerk were never given a choice about any of it. They did not get to weigh the Cold War calculus, the national security arguments, the strategic necessity. They just died in the dark, underground, building rockets for a regime that viewed them as less than human. And then the men who oversaw their deaths came to America and were given houses in the suburbs and security clearances and government salaries and places of honor at presidential events. That happened. It is documented. It is real. The moon landing was real too. History at its most honest is the act of holding both of those truths at the same time, without flinching, without looking away, without pretending that the one cancels out the other. That's what the history experiment is here to do, to give you the full story, not the comfortable version, the real one.
If this episode changed how you think about the space race, about the cost of achievement, about the choices governments make in the dark, then you already know what to do. Hit that like button. It takes 1 second. It tells the algorithm that stories like this one deserve to be seen. Subscribe to the History Experiment if you haven't already. We go where the textbooks don't, every single episode. Share this video with someone who thinks they know the history of NASA. Show them what they missed. And drop a comment below. Do you think Operation Paperclip was necessary? Could America have gotten to the moon without the German scientists? Or was the cost, the cover-up, the protection of war criminals, the erasure of victims, too high a price to pay for a moon landing? I want to know what you think, because history isn't just something that happened, it's something we're still arguing about, and that argument matters. The History Experiment. The stories they didn't want you to find. We'll see you in the next one.